Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Understanding Our Founders' Constitution. We have been on a study, if you will, or a quest perhaps, because it's been, maybe 2 or more months, probably closer to 3 months, that we've been discussing this idea of a convention of the states for the purpose of proposing amendments that's being promoted in different corners of the country, and certainly by the book written by Mark Levin titled The Liberty Amendments. And we've been going through not only just this idea, but also the different amendments that Mr. Levin proposes. And I've been discussing my personal views and thoughts on them. And for the last couple of weeks, we've been discussing the 10th of his 11th amendments, basically the amendment to grant the state the authority to check Congress. And I've already pointed out some of the things I have an agreement with this, some of the things I have a problem with this. However, what I do find in agreement with is the fact that what this amendment is attempting to do is to restore to the states their 9th and 10th Amendment authority and rights. And I find it interesting that Mr. Levin, if you listen to his radio show, constantly puts down those who hold to the doctrine of the states' rights to nullify federal laws or overreaches of their constitutional authority. And yet that's precisely what this amendment is trying to, shall I say, codify or constitutionalize by adding it to the amendment. And yet, as I have tried to show the last episode or two of our gatherings together, is the states do have this authority, and our founders thought that they did. And I had promised that when we got done with the analysis of this amendment that I would give with you, or share with you rather, what I have proposed as perhaps an approach to the states regaining this authority without having to amend the Constitution. And that is a return to the power of the states to nullify overreaches of federal authority and federal actions. Now, what I'm going to share with you tonight is a letter that I have written upon request to one of our state representatives here in Texas, one of our legislators in Austin, as well as one of our state senators. And so, without any further ado, let me share with you this letter this evening to give you my ideas to how I think we could approach this and the reasoning for it. Now, this is all based upon the concept of federalism, where the states and the federal government are to be checks against one another with shared power, that those given to the federal government are, as Madison said, few and defined, and all the others given to the states are very broad and undefined. And so I want to give you this quote from Federalist number 28, written by Alexander Hamilton, in which he states that the state governments are to be the guardians of the people's freedom from encroachment of the general government. Here's what he wrote. He said, "It may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. Projects of usurpation cannot be masked under the pretenses so likely to escape the penetration of select bodies of men as of the people at large. The legislatures will have better means of information. They can discover the danger at a distance, and possessing all the organs of civil power and the confidence of the people, they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other in the different states and unite in their common forces for the protection of their common liberty." Now, I chose this particular quote from many of the others because it outlines precisely my approach as to how the states can reassert their 10th Amendment authority. My recommendation is precisely what Hamilton wrote that the states can and should do: communicate with each other, formulate a unified plan of opposition, and combine their forces in array against the power of coerciveness that Washington has amassed over the past century. My thought is to have the legislature of Texas choose a committee of a few constitutionally minded men and women to coordinate with other such committees from other states that share our desire to thwart the impending tyranny of the general government. These states would be in those in the South and Midwest, the so-called red states. Each committee within each state would appoint one representative and a convention called at which these appointed representatives would discuss and formulate resolutions of nullification and intention to reject any and all attempts by the general government to impose unconstitutional laws and regulations. Once these resolutions are drafted, they could then be submitted to the committees of the states they represent to then head up the effort to have the entire legislative body of each state vote and adopt them. One or two states cannot take on Washington, but 20, 30, 40? That's a completely different matter, and Washington could not easily ignore or dismiss the opposition and therefore have to back down. The challenge is in this, and that is that you may have some of the leadership in the different states, and here I was talking about Texas. Our current Speaker of the House, Joe Straus, is not a conservative, and that he would probably oppose such a move. And so the challenge would be in these states would be for the leadership to be convinced to allow this to happen. But now let me return back to my letter that I gave these two gentlemen. The problem will be difficult, as Madison evaluated in the Federalist number 46, has been turned on its head. Here's what Madison wrote. It has already been proved that the members of the federal will be more dependent on the members of the state governments than the latter will be on the former. Clearly, states are more dependent upon the general government due to the flow of money. But if Texas and other states were to nullify Obamacare or any encroachments on any other area, Washington could not lawfully touch any of the funds it sends our way for programs not associated with those laws that we nullify. The point I would make to others in Austin, if I were to make the case, is the warning issued by the Anti-Federalists in Pennsylvania in their minority report issued on December 18, 1787. They wrote, "We dissent secondly, because the powers vested in Congress by this Constitution must necessarily annihilate and absorb the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the several states, and produce from their ruins one consolidated government, which from the nature of things will be an iron-handed despotism, as nothing short of the supremacy of despotic sway could connect and govern these United States under one government. The main pillars of the Constitution, which we have shown to be inconsistent with the liberty and happiness of the people, as its establishment will annihilate the state governments and produce one consolidated government that will eventually and speedily issue in the supremacy of despotism." It was not the Constitution, as these men feared, that has brought us to the danger we now face. It was the failure of us, the citizens, to vet and elect men and women who would be true to the principles of the Constitution. You and I would both recognize and preach this, but it doesn't alter the fact that we have reached the point at which they forewarned this would happen. Therefore, the states must stand up for us, the individuals, for we have no one else to look to for defense. To fail in this duty is to fail the cause of freedom and the sacrifices of all who have gone before us in the preservation of it. Standing up to Washington by those of you who we have elected to our state legislature is not an option. It is your duty to us, our posterity, and to the world, as we are the last great hope of mankind, as Ronald Reagan once said. Thomas Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions of 1798 present the strongest argument for states standing up to the encroaching power of the general government, as Hamilton had argued in the Federalist. As you read them, note how many times the word void or of no effect are used, and you can't help but hear the resounding thunder of his arguments. Now, the counter-argument is made by opponents to nullification that the other states rejected the notion of nullification as outlined by Jefferson. This isn't the case. In both the Kentucky resolutions and Madison's Virginia resolutions, the appeal was made for the other states to join them in overturning the alien sedition legislative laws that the Federalists in Congress had passed. There is no indication that they flat out said this is not constitutional. They just chose not to join in with the protest, as they were mostly controlled by the Federalists against whom Jefferson and Madison were protesting. If you have never read Jefferson's follow-up to the Kentucky resolutions, that is the draft declaration and protest to the Commonwealth of Virginia on the principles of the Constitution of the United States of America and the violations of them, written in December 1825, he goes even further to contend that as a last resort, states have the right to secede from the Union. I'll beg your patience and offer you just a few of the more important quotes from it. He wrote, "The states in North America which confederated to establish their independence entered into a compact which is called the Constitution of the United States of America, by which they agreed to unite in a single government, as to their relations with each other and with foreign nations, and as to certain other articles particularly specified. They retained, at the same time, each to itself, the other rights of independent government, comprehending mainly their domestic interests. But the federal branch has assumed in some cases and claimed in others a right of enlarging its own powers by constructions, inferences, and indefinite deductions from those directly given, which the Assembly does declare to be usurpations of the powers retained to the independent branches, mere interpolations into the compact and direct infractions of it. This Assembly does further disavow and declare to be most false and unfounded the doctrine that the compact in authorizing its federal branch to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States has given them thereby a power to do whatever they may think or pretend would promote the general welfare, which construction would make that of itself a complete government, without limitation of powers, but that the plain sense and obvious meaning were that they might levy the taxes necessary to provide for the general welfare by the various acts of the powers therein specified and delegated to them, and by no others. Whilst the General Assembly thus declares the rights retained by the states, rights which they have never yielded, and which this state will never voluntarily yield, they do not mean to raise the banner of disaffection or a separation from their sister states, co-parties with themselves to this compact. They would indeed consider such a rupture as among the greatest calamities which could befall them, but not the greatest. There is yet one greater, submission to a government of unlimited powers. It is only when the hope of avoiding this shall become absolutely desperate that further forbearance could not be indulged." Unquote. I realize that those reluctant to take this stand will fall back on the so-called Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the Constitution, because it asserts that the Constitution trumps state laws. My counter to that position is that yes, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, but not laws made that are contrary to it. So many who would make this case equate legislation that the Supreme Court of the United States does not rule as unconstitutional must be constitutional and therefore supreme. However, the wording of that clause states, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be made in pursuance thereof, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land." If states determine, as is their 10th Amendment right, that a law passed by the Congress is not in pursuance of or under the authority of, that is, pertaining to the limited powers delegated to the general government by the states, the United States, that is, the Constitution, is therefore not supreme and therefore cannot supersede state law. Furthermore, I would contend that under the Constitution the United States shall guarantee to every state in this Union a republican form of government, that for the general government to overstep its bounds and impose upon the citizens of a state laws and regulations contrary to their wishes is to destroy the republicanism of that state. Again, this is a support to the powers retained by the states and the people as set forth in both the 9th and 10th Amendments. A good example of this can be seen where a few states have passed legislation allowing for the legalization of marijuana for medicinal purposes, and now even a few for recreational use. This is in defiance of federal law, but you don't see the feds running to court to overturn those assertions of states' rights. And so there, ladies and gentlemen, is my letter and my proposal as to how the states could stand up to the federal government and to overturn unconstitutional laws, regulations, and acts. Now, I talked about them joining together in this committee, in this convention. This is not one that is specified by the Constitution. States are sovereign independent units that are free to act as they want. So therefore, the calling of the convention such as this is not for the purpose of making amendments. It is exactly as Hamilton and Jefferson argued the states could do, and that is for them to decide on a course of action that together they could stand as a unified group in opposition to unconstitutional overreaches of power by the federal government and an overreach into our lives as citizens of the various states. Now, we have seen where in Obamacare several attorney generals joined together and filed suit. 30-some states joined together in this suit against Obamacare. They lost at the Supreme Court. But filing suit in federal court against the federal government is kind of like asking the fox to guard the chicken coop. That does not work. That is why I have said if states band together and united tell the federal government to take a hike, and that what they are trying to do will be null and void within their territory, the federal government, the folks in Washington, would have to back down because they're facing a determined group and not just one or two individual states. So that is my solution to how the states could reassert their 9th and 10th Amendments. I hope you found it interesting and enlightening. Until next week, I wish you a good night and a happy and prosperous week.